becoming tedious. I've told it 1,000 times, but it came from an old song by the Hollies. I was listening to this thing, and it was a song called Pegasus, and it's a really creepy song. And I quite like the Hollies, you know. I don't want these guys to hear me continually saying your songs are creepy, guys, because I actually quite enjoy a few of their songs. But this song is particularly creepy, and it's about a flying horse, apparently Pegasus. And if you take drugs, you see this flying horse, which I think is what the song's about. But there's a middle eight in it, which has got a kind of pervert quality. And suddenly, into my head came the notion of this. Imagine this thing was real, because the song's so sickening and saccharine, it really makes you want to vomit when you're listening to it. And I thought, but imagine this animal was real, because, you know, really, Pegasus shouldn't make me want to vomit. But imagine it did. So suddenly the notion of, if you were the most cynical man on earth, suddenly stuck with this little cartoon horse who's indefatigably cheerful and really irritating. You know, if you can imagine like Martin Lawrence as Ruby Rod doing this thing. So I kind of saw it as that, and it just seemed like the ultimate, almost like a buddy movie idea of having these complete opposites plunged into this ridiculous story involving paedophile Santa Clauses and drugs and sex.
And the adaptation for the screen, I can't remember, is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, the RZA from Wu-Tang, or yeah, I'm RZA, fuck yeah.
How did you meet RZA?
Well, he got in touch. He was interested. He'd seen the comic, and I met him in Los Angeles. And the first thing we started talking about was UFOs. The minute we sat down, the first word that comes out of my mouth, so about the UFOs then. And the two of us were instantly bonded from that moment on. So, yeah, I mean, obviously he's a cool guy. He's kind of interested in a lot of the same stuff I am, and he had a take on the material and a viewpoint on the material that I really liked. So yeah, I mean, he's attached to it now. We'll see what happens next. It'd be interesting to see that. I think it'd be pretty good. You
have spent your career, as far as I can tell, burning down and rebuilding superheroes. Mm-hmm. Why is that something that's interesting to you?
It's just a thing I identify with them, you know, and I think anyone identifies with superheroes if you think about it enough. You know, in our own stories we all feel like superheroes. You know, our love stories are the greatest love stories ever. When we buy a new house, it's the greatest buying of a new house ever. So in our own lives we kind of feel superhuman, and I love superhero stories because they so directly address those feelings. You know, everything in a superhero comic is symbolic. And it's about how we live. You know, I don't see them as fantasy stories at all, so maybe that's just my problem. But to me they're actually social realism. You can talk about how we feel in a way that just realism can't handle, realism can't deal with it. Realism doesn't deal with the fantastic worlds that we all have inside our heads and the space within that little mess of bone there. You know, like black and white 1960s films about living in a cold water apartment don't really tell you how it feels to live in a cold water apartment, because when you do live in a cold water apartment, it generally feels like a palace. You know, I remember when I was a kid we were poor, but my house felt like a palace. So I kind of, that's what I love about superhero stories. Everything's a palace, everyone's special, everyone's amazing, but at the same time it allows us to look at the problems that we have and the world we live in.
We had a really interesting conversation the last time we spoke. It was a room like this, but I don't remember where or when. It was like a Gershwin song. And you were talking about Superman, and how Superman is recreated for the audience that needs him, be it a man of the people. Yeah. And I was wondering if you could talk about that. I thought it was really interesting.
I think it just seems to be a function of characters like Superman and Batman, and to a lesser extent maybe even James Bond. Say the characters have been around for a long, long time. They have always proven themselves to be pretty adaptable. You know, they can fit into anything. If you look at Superman as an example, Superman starts out in 1938 as a socialist fighter for justice. He's quite clearly kind of left-wing guy. He fights against the power, he fights against the man, he fights against City Hall. You give that 10 years and suddenly there's a war on, and Superman's riding missiles down into the face of the Japanese. And it's a completely different character, but yet there's something about that core Superman that stays the same. In the 50s, suddenly he's a suburban dad with his own house and his own pets and his own relatives and all these ridiculous problems that he has. In the 60s, he's a cosmic seeker, he's helping Indians over land rights issues, he's fighting against polluters, you know, and so on through the decades. So he's responded to basically what is, in each case, what is our idea of the ultimate man. And Superman has always played that part. If you look at him in the 70s, our idea of the ultimate man is he's a kind of Italian, Victor Mature looking character who's very bombastic. You know, Superman in the 70s is constantly punching people. You felt that, didn't you? You know, he's constantly aggressive. You know, Batman's the same. Every time they beat somebody up, it's like, hey, your jaw's like a soap bubble, buddy. It's okay, Batman, you didn't need to tell me. You're fucking Batman. I'm just some baldy henchman. Of course you're going to kick ass. But if you look at the characters, they're quite surprisingly macho in the 70s. So I mean, for me, it's always interesting the way each generation, what do they look up to? You know, and the current Superman is very much, it's kind of half Christ, half, you know, Martin Luther King. It's a very strange, this is what we look up to now.
The idea that he becomes what his nation needs reminds me of King Arthur a little bit. Yeah. And it's interesting that he has become a folk hero.
Yeah, pretty much. And I think characters like Superman and Batman have the potential to persist for centuries even, you know. I think they've got that. Something like Batman is such a powerful archetype and such a refinement of an archetype that I think there's a good chance it will last like Robin Hood and King Arthur have lasted.
The idea of